My name is Chris Vance. I'm 30 years old, and my hands almost always smell like motor oil and antifreeze. To me, that smell is synonymous with honesty. It means something broken has been fixed, that chaos has been brought to order, that a day hasn't been wasted. I own a small auto repair shop in Georgetown, a southern Seattle neighborhood where old brick buildings stand shoulder to shoulder with humming warehouses and craft breweries. It's not the most prestigious part of town, but it's real. Here, nobody cares about the brand of your shirt or the model of your phone. All that matters is whether you can handle a wrench and keep your word. And I like that. My life is composed of sounds. The roar of a rebuilt engine firing up for the first time, the click of a torque wrench, the quiet hiss of a welding torch. It's my symphony, my world, understandable and predictable. But once a month, that world crumbles when I'm forced to cross the West Seattle Bridge and drive into another universe, the universe of my family. The Vance family lives in a world of chrome and glass, a world where the scent of money has displaced all others. My father, Richard Vance, is the CEO of Vance Innovations, a tech giant whose skyscrapers pierce the perpetually gray Seattle sky. My uncle, Mark, his younger brother, serves as the COO. Together, they are an unbreakable duo, titans of this Silicon Forest, as some glossy magazine once dubbed them. Their life is an endless series of board meetings, multi-million-dollar deals, charity galas where they smile for the cameras, and lavish parties at their mansions overlooking Lake Washington. And me? I'm the one who shows up to these gatherings in my 20-year-old pickup truck, which I've rebuilt myself down to the last bolt, and parks it far away from the gleaming rows of Teslas and Porsches belonging to my cousins. Chris, are you still messing around in that dirty garage? Don't you ever want something more? That's the standard question from my cousin Kevin, delivered with a permanent smirk, while his sister Jessica pointedly photographs her new Cardi, a bracelet against the sunset. To them, I'm a curiosity from a sideshow. The only Vance who didn't understand that the main goal in life is to turn the numbers in your bank account into even bigger numbers. My father usually just looks at me with cold disappointment. His gaze says more than words ever could. I built an empire, and my only son prefers to play with oily rags. Uncle Mark is more subtle. He'll slap me on the back, feigning friendliness. Everyone has their own path, Chris. The important thing is that you're happy, tinkering with your engines. But I see the same contempt in his eyes. In this frigid world, there are only two people who look at me differently. My mother, Helen, a quiet woman with perpetually sad eyes, who always tries to sit next to me at the enormous dining table and discreetly slides the best piece of steak onto my plate. She never argues with my father, but her hand squeezing mine when no one is looking says everything. Just be yourself, honey, she whispers. It's as if she's trying to protect me from a world she herself can't escape. And there was my grandfather, Arthur Vance. To the rest of the family, he was just another disappointment. Old man Arthur, the father of Richard and Mark, who lived in his modest house an hour's drive from the city, surrounded by dense forests and silence. The family considered him an eccentric, a washed-up engineer who missed his chance and was now living out his days amidst rusty junk in his workshop. My father once remarked at a dinner party, "Don't expect any inheritance from him. All he has is an old house and a mountain of garbage he calls projects." But to me, Grandpa Arthur was an entire universe. Every weekend, I'd get in my pickup and drive out to see him. His house smelled of old wood, rosin, and cooled coffee. And his workshop? Oh, that was my sanctuary. A huge garage crammed with lathes, oscilloscopes, boxes of radio components, old blueprints, and books on physics and engineering. Grandpa Arthur, a tall, stooped old man with white hair and hands covered in scars from soldering irons and small burns, was the smartest person I knew. He taught me how to read schematics, operate a lathe, and understand the logic of an internal combustion engine. We could sit for hours in comfortable silence, him disassembling some old radio, me rebuilding a carburetor from a lawnmower. "You see, Chris," he'd say, his eyes fixed on a tangle of wires. "There are two kinds of people in the world. Those who create and those who sell. The sellers will always be richer, but the creators, they sleep at night. They know they've left behind something more than just numbers in an account." He rarely spoke of his past, of his work in the aerospace industry during the days when the whole country dreamed of the stars. But sometimes, looking at an old photograph on the wall where he stood next to a model rocket, His eyes would grow distant. "We were on the verge of great things," he whispered once. "We could have changed the world. But people are people. Greed and pride ruin everything." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I felt a deep, old pain in his voice. The last time I saw him was last Saturday. He was unusually quiet. We drank coffee on his porch, and he stared at the forest for a long time. "Chris," he said suddenly, turning to me. His gaze was sharp, piercing. "Whatever happens, remember this. Real value doesn't shine. Sometimes it's hidden under layers of rust and dust, and only someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty can find it." He squeezed my shoulder with his bony, yet still strong, hand. "You're a good kid, Chris. Better than all of them. Never forget that." I didn't know those would be his last words to me. That under the layers of rust and dust, he was hiding a secret that would soon turn my world upside down. The call came on a Wednesday morning. I was just finishing up a brake job on an old Ford, my hands black to the elbows with graphite grease. My mother's name flashed on the screen. I wiped a hand on a rag and answered. Her voice was quiet, choked, and devoid of all emotion. The way people speak when a piece of news is so terrible that the tears haven't yet found their way out. "Chris, it's Grandpa. He's gone." The world stopped for a moment. The sound of the air compressor in the background seemed deafeningly loud, then faded into a ringing silence in my ears. "What? How?" I managed to choke out. "A heart attack. Sometime during the night. The neighbor found him this morning on the porch. He was just sitting in his chair." I sank onto a toolbox, my legs numb. An image flashed in my mind. Grandpa in his old rocking chair, looking out at the forest, just like our last meeting. I pictured the night descending on his quiet house as he simply drifted off, lulled to sleep by the sound of the trees. The thought brought a strange, bitter comfort, but it was quickly drowned in a wave of pain. The man who had been my North Star, my only true friend in the family, was gone. The funeral took place 2 days later at a small cemetery not far from his house. It was a typically Seattle day, low gray clouds, a drizzling rain that made the damp earth smell particularly sharp. The Vance family arrived in full force, turning the modest ceremony into something resembling a corporate event. My father and Uncle Mark stood by the coffin in perfectly tailored black suits, their faces equally stern and empty. They offered practiced words of condolence to distant relatives and old neighbors, shaking hands with the same businesslike grip they used to sign multi-million-dollar contracts. My cousins, Kevin and Jessica, were openly bored. Kevin kept checking his phone, while Jessica quietly complained that the rain would ruin her expensive hairdo. Their grief was as fake as their designer handbags. They were here because it was expected, because skipping the funeral of the dynasty's founder, however disgraced, would be in poor taste and bad PR. I stood a little apart, under an old weeping willow, letting the raindrops run down my face, mixing with the tears I didn't try to hide. I wasn't wearing an expensive suit, just simple black trousers and an old jacket my mom kept for such occasions. I felt like a stranger at this festival of hypocrisy. My grief was quiet and deep, and it had no place amidst this stage performance. My mother came and stood silently beside me, taking my arm. Her face was pale, her eyes red. She was the only one not playing a role. Her sadness was genuine, but it was a sadness for many things at once. For her departed father-in-law, for her son who was once again an outsider, and perhaps for her own life, trapped in a gilded cage. After the ceremony, the family proceeded to a reception my father had organized at a high-end country club. "You have to go, Chris," my mother said. "For Grandpa." I didn't understand what this banquet had to do with my grandfather, who despised such places, but I went for her sake. The restaurant, with its panoramic windows overlooking a golf course, was filled with hushed conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the scent of expensive perfume. People talked about business, the stock market, their upcoming Hawaiian vacations. Arthur Vance's name was mentioned only in passing, in the context of he lived a long life, or at least he didn't suffer. I sat at a far table, picking at a salad I couldn't swallow. Uncle Mark approached me with a glass of whiskey. "Hang in there, kid," he said, clapping my shoulder. The old man was a tough nut. A shame he never came to his senses. Could be living like a king right now. I looked up at him. "He did live like a king," I said quietly. "He had everything he needed." My uncle just grunted, not understanding or not wanting to. and moved on to a group of businessmen where the conversation immediately returned to quarterly reports. That evening, when I finally returned to my empty apartment, the sense of loneliness hit me with renewed force. I opened a drawer and took out an old photograph. I was about 10, sitting on Grandpa's lap in his workshop, both of us grimy and happy, holding a model airplane we had just built. Looking at his smiling face, I heard his words again: real value doesn't shine. Only someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty can find it. I didn't know then how prophetic those words would be. I thought I had lost my mentor. But in reality, he was just beginning to teach me his most important lesson. A lesson that was buried under decades of lies, dust, and family secrets. And to learn it, I would indeed have to get my hands very dirty. A week after the funeral, we were all summoned to the gleaming office of the family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, for the reading of the will. The office was on the 50th floor of the Vance Innovations Tower, its windows offering a panoramic view of Seattle sprawling out to Puget Sound. This was my father's world, a world where power and money were as tangible as the view from that window. The entire family was assembled. My father sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, his face as impenetrable as ever. Uncle Mark sat beside him, tapping an expensive Montblanc pen on the tabletop. Kevin and Jessica were whispering, clearly anticipating what portion of their grandfather's modest assets would supplement their already bloated trust funds. Mom sat next to me, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. I felt as if I had walked into the wrong room by mistake. I expected nothing. I knew Grandpa didn't have money in the sense my family measured it. His wealth was in books, tools, and memories. Mr. Henderson, a balding man in a perfectly tailored suit, cleared his throat and began to read. The will was short and, like my grandpa, to the point. The house and the land it stood on were left in equal shares to his sons, Richard and Mark, in the hope that they will finally understand the value of things that cannot be bought. My father's lip curled almost imperceptibly at the phrasing. Uncle Mark just smirked. They had already been discussing how the land could be profitably sold to a developer for a housing tract. The small amount of cash in his bank account, about $100,000, was to be divided equally between his grandchildren, Kevin and Jessica. They exchanged disappointed glances. Clearly, they had expected more. And finally, Henderson continued, his eyes shifting to me. To my grandson, Christopher Vance, I leave the entire contents of my workshop, as well as my old Aristo brand wristwatch. A silence hung in the room for a beat, and then Kevin couldn't help but snort. The workshop? You mean the mountain of rusty junk? Grandpa always was a joker. Jessica giggled into her hand. And a broken watch. Chris, you'll have something to prop your garage door open with now. My father shot me a heavy look, a mixture of shame and irritation, as if my very presence and this ridiculous inheritance were a personal affront to him. Is that all? He asked the lawyer coldly. Yes, Mr. Vance. That is all, Henderson confirmed, neatly folding the papers. I sat motionless, feeling the blood rush to my face. It wasn't about the junk or the watch. It was about the humiliation, the open way my family displayed their contempt. But cutting through the humiliation was another feeling, curiosity. Why the workshop specifically? And why that watch? I remembered it. Old, scratched, with a cracked crystal and hands that were permanently stopped. Grandpa never wore it. It just lay on his workbench. After the formalities were concluded, Mr. Henderson handed me an old key to the workshop and a small velvet box. Inside, on a bed of faded silk, lay the watch. The stainless steel case was a network of scratches, the leather strap cracked with age. The hands were frozen at 10:08. I silently took the box and the key and walked out of the office without saying goodbye. I could feel the family's eyes on my back, a blend of mockery and pity. That same evening, I drove to Grandpa's house. It stood silent and orphaned. I didn't go into the house, heading straight for the workshop. The old iron key turned in the lock with a screech, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with the familiar scent, a mixture of oil, ozone, and dust. Everything was in its place. The lathe against the wall, the workbench cluttered with tools, the shelves of books and boxes of components. This was my grandfather's world, and now it was mine. I sat down at the workbench and opened the box with the watch. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the cracked crystal with my finger. Just an old, useless thing. An inheritance for the family failure. But then I remembered his words. Real value doesn't shine. It's hidden under layers of rust and dust. I picked up a small screwdriver and a magnifying glass, tools he had taught me to use. I decided that if this watch was all he had left me, I at least owed it to him to understand how it worked. I carefully pried off the back cover. It popped open with a soft click. Inside, instead of the familiar clockwork of gears and springs, I saw something entirely different. It wasn't a mechanism. It was a complex microcircuit, sealed in epoxy resin. And in the very center, etched onto a tiny metal disc, was an inscription, too small to read with the naked eye. I brought the magnifying glass to my eye. The etching was perfectly precise. It wasn't words. It was a set of numbers and letters. A113, L47, P89. My heart began to beat faster. This didn't look like a serial number. This looked like a code. A key. Grandpa hadn't left me junk. He had left me a puzzle. And I realized that the answer to it was somewhere here, within the walls of this old, dusty workshop. My journey was just beginning. For the next few days, I practically lived in my grandfather's workshop. I'd arrive before dawn and leave late at night, my eyes gritty with fatigue. I temporarily handed over my own shop to my assistant, telling him I had urgent family business. In a way, it was the truth. I was obsessed. The code etched in the watch, A113, L47, P89, gave me no peace. I filled several pages of a notebook trying to decipher it. I tried substituting letters in the alphabet, applying simple Caesar ciphers, but nothing worked. It was either something more complex, or, conversely, laughably simple, but the key to solving it eluded me. I decided to be methodical, just as Grandpa had taught me. If the code was the key, then the lock had to be somewhere in here. I began a systematic search of the workshop. Inch by inch, I tapped walls, checked floorboards, peered into every drawer. The workshop was huge, and it felt like it would take an eternity. Shelves reaching to the ceiling were crammed with hundreds of books and magazines on physics, electronics, and metallurgy. Popular mechanics from the 60s, bound volumes of radio and television news, thick reference manuals on transistors. I took them down one by one, flipping through them, shaking them, hoping a note would fall out. But all I found were dried leaves, old bookmarks, and Grandpa's faint pencil marks in the margins, formulas, diagrams, questions. On the third day, when I was on the verge of despair, I noticed something about how the books were organized. At first glance, it was chaos. But then I saw the system. Grandpa hadn't arranged them alphabetically or by subject, but by some principle of his own. I started looking closely at the spines. And then it hit me. ALP. These might not be letters in a cipher, but designations for the shelves themselves. I looked around. On the ends of the three main shelving units, I found faint, hand-scratched letters. A, B, C, and so on. My heart hammered. I walked over to the unit marked now for the number 113. Could it be the shelf? No, there were only 7 shelves. The book number, then? I started scanning the books for any kind of numbering. Nothing. Then I thought like an engineer. A coordinate system. ILA. What if 113 wasn't one number, but 2? 11 and 3? Or 1 and 13? I looked at the shelves. They were numbered from top to bottom. I found shelf number 1. And what was 13? I started counting the books from left to right. In the 13th spot stood a thick, battered tome, Standard Handbook for Mechanical Engineers, 1968 edition. I pulled the book out. It was heavy, smelling of dust and time. I flipped through it. Nothing. No notes. No inserted slips of paper. I was about to put it back when I felt that the spine of the book was unnaturally thick. I carefully ran a knife along it. Beneath a layer of cardboard was a small cavity. And inside, a tiny, tightly rolled cylinder of microfilm. My hands were shaking. I had found the first piece. Now for the second. ILL, coordinates 47. 4th shelf, 7th book. It was a collection of science fiction by Ray Bradbury, The Martian Chronicles. Grandpa loved Bradbury. He used to say that sci-fi writers saw the future more clearly than politicians. In this book, tucked between pages 47 and 48, I found a thin metal plate, like a stencil. It had symbols and lines cut into it. And finally, ILP, coordinates 89. 8th shelf, 9th book. A textbook on crystallography. Inside, in a carefully carved-out hollow, lay a small lens, like one from a microscope. So, I had 3 elements, a microfilm, a stencil, and a lens. Separately, they were useless, but together, I cleared a space on the workbench. I plugged in Grandpa's old slide projector, which he used to view transparencies. I replaced the standard objective with the lens I'd found in the book. Then I carefully unrolled the microfilm and mounted it in a frame. I switched on the projector. A blurry image appeared on the wall. I picked up the metal stencil and held it up to the lens. The image snapped into focus. It was a blueprint, a complex, detailed blueprint of some kind of device. I had never seen anything like it. It didn't look like an engine or a radio circuit. It was some kind of multi-layered crystalline structure, with fine conductors connecting them in an intricate pattern. At the bottom, in the corner of the blueprint, was a signature, Project Prometheus. Direct Energy Conversion Module. Arthur Vance. 1975. Direct Energy Conversion. I had read about it in old magazines. It was the holy grail of physics. The theoretical possibility of converting ambient energy, heat, light, even static electricity, directly into electrical power with an efficiency approaching 100%. It would be a revolution. The end of the fossil fuel era. Free, clean energy for the entire world. I stared at the blueprint, my breath catching in my throat. My grandfather, the quiet old man my family considered a failure, had been on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history. But why was the world still burning oil and coal? Why was this blueprint hidden in his workshop and not in a patent office? I looked back at the table where the 3 books lay. The Engineer's Handbook, The Martian Chronicles, Crystallography. The Builder, The Dreamer, and The Scientist. That was him. That was my grandfather. And I realized this blueprint was only the beginning. Somewhere in this workshop, there had to be a prototype. And the story of why Project Prometheus had never seen the light of day. I switched off the projector and sat in the darkness. The smell of dust and oil no longer seemed mundane. Now, it smelled of a secret I had to uncover. Finding the blueprint for Project Prometheus was a turning point. I was no longer just sifting through junk in search of something vague. I had a purpose. I had to find the prototype and understand what happened to this revolutionary invention. I began scouring the workshop again, but this time my search was focused. I was looking for traces of a specific project, boxes of crystals, measurement logs, unusually shaped components. In a far corner, under a dusty tarp, I found what I was looking for. It was a massive metal cabinet, like a safe, but with no visible lock or handle. It was old, covered in a thick layer of dust, and looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. I circled it, running my hands over its surface. No keyholes, no combination dials. It was just a smooth steel box. I spent a full day trying to figure out how to open it. I tried prying at the door, tapping it for hidden mechanisms, all futile. I was ready to give up and grab an angle grinder, but I stopped myself. Grandpa was an engineer, not a safecracker. He wouldn't use brute force. There had to be an elegant, clever solution. I went back to the workbench and forced myself to think. What else had he left me? The watch, the workshop, the code, the blueprints. And then my eyes fell on the watch, lying on the workbench. The hands were frozen at 10:08. Could that be more than a coincidence? I remembered seeing several old analog instruments in the workshop with dials. I walked over to a large oscilloscope on a separate cart. It had several control knobs. I started turning them. One controlled frequency, another amplitude. I set them to 10 and 8, respectively. Nothing happened. I tried every instrument in the place. No result. Frustrated, I returned to the safe. I leaned my back against it and ran my hand wearily over its cold surface. And suddenly, my fingers brushed against something. On the side panel, almost imperceptible to the touch, were 4 small indentations. I looked closer. They weren't just dents. Inside each one was a tiny photosensor. The lock was light-activated. But what was the code? 10:08 again. I shone my flashlight on the first and third photosensors, mimicking the binary code for 10, 1010, and then on the second and fourth for 8, 1000. Nothing. Then I thought about the watch again. 10:08. It wasn't just numbers. It was the position of the hands. The hour hand at 10, the minute hand just past the 1. I pictured a clock face. The position of the minute hand at 8 minutes corresponds to a specific angle. I estimated it. About 48 degrees from the vertical. And the hour hand, 10 o'clock, is 300 degrees. I took my flashlight again and aimed it at the photosensors corresponding to those angles. First the one at the 300-degree position, then the one at 48 degrees. There was a soft click, followed by a low hum. The door of the safe slowly, with the hiss of hydraulics, retracted into the side. My breath caught in my throat. Inside, resting on a velvet pedestal, was the prototype. It was no bigger than a soccer ball, a perfect sphere of dark metal, polished to a mirror finish. A fine spiral etching, just like on the blueprint, ran across its surface. The device looked alien, flawless. Next to the prototype lay a thick, leather-bound journal. I picked it up. The leather was worn, but of high quality. On the first page, in my grandfather's calligraphic script, was written, Project Prometheus. Logbook, 1972 to 1978. I sat down right there on the floor and began to read. My grandfather's voice, the one I had known my whole life, calm, a little weary, now spoke from the pages of the journal, but it was different. It was young, full of enthusiasm and hope. He described his first experiments, the failures, the breakthroughs. He wrote of sleepless nights, of moments of despair and triumph. He believed his invention would change the world, end the wars for resources, give humanity a fresh start. He had founded a small company with his now-adult sons, Richard and Mark. He called it Prometheus Energy. Grandpa was the brain, the genius inventor, and his sons, my father and uncle, were supposed to handle the business side, attract investors, and bring the product to market. At first, everything went well. They secured a few grants, built a lab. Richard and Mark were ambitious and convincing. But as the project neared completion, the tone of the journal entries began to change. May 15, 1977. Richard was talking about commercial potential again. He doesn't understand. This isn't for sale. This must belong to everyone. He looks at me like I'm a crazy idealist. Mark backs him up on everything. They whisper behind my back. It makes me uneasy. September 3, 1977. We had a successful test today. The module ran stable for 6 hours, powering the entire lab. I was ecstatic. But Richard and Mark, they weren't happy. They looked at the numbers on the instruments with a kind of predatory greed. That evening, they brought me papers. A proposal to sell exclusive rights to an oil conglomerate. For a fortune, I refused. We had a terrible fight. Richard shouted that I would bury them all with my naivety. The final entry was dated January 12, 1978. It was written in a shaky hand. They betrayed me. I came to the lab this morning, and security wouldn't let me in. They said I was removed from my position by order of the board of directors. What board? It was just me and my sons. They forged my signature. They claimed I was mentally unstable and a threat to the company. They took everything. All my blueprints, all my research. They stole my dream. They stole the future. I only managed to grab the very first prototype in this journal. My boys. My own sons. What am I to do? I closed the journal. My hands were trembling. There was a lump in my throat. The picture was complete. Vance Innovations, my father's empire, was built on the ruins of his own father's dream. They didn't just steal a technology. They broke a man. They robbed the world of its chance for a better future just to line their own pockets. That oil conglomerate he mentioned, they probably didn't buy the technology, but paid Richard and Mark to bury it forever. And my father and uncle, with that seed money, founded their new company, focusing on safer, more mundane technologies. I looked at the gleaming sphere of the prototype. It wasn't just an invention. It was evidence. Evidence of my grandfather's genius and of my father and uncle's monstrous betrayal. Grandpa's words from our last meeting took on a new, terrible meaning. Real value is hidden under layers of rust and dust. He wasn't talking about the watch. He was talking about the truth. And he had left it for me, his grandson, to dare to unearth it. The next few days passed in a haze. I reread my grandfather's journal over and over, each line a fresh stab of pain in my heart. I pictured him, young and full of hope, and then broken, betrayed by his own children. I looked at the Prometheus prototype, that silent work of engineering art, and saw not just a machine, but a monument to a dream that never was. My world had been turned on its head. My father, whom I had always seen as merely cold and demanding, now appeared as a monster. Uncle Mark, with his slick jokes and patronizing tone, seemed even more loathsome in his cynicism. Their entire empire, their mansions, their expensive cars and watches, all of it was built on a foundation of lies and betrayal. My own life, my place in this family that I had always taken for granted, now looked different. Their disdain for me, for my choice to be a simple mechanic suddenly made a new kind of sense. Of course, they despised me. I was too much like him. Like my grandfather. Honest, a lover of working with my hands, uninterested in money for its own sake. I was a living rebuke to their conscience, if they even had one. I knew I couldn't let this go. I couldn't just lock the journal and prototype back in the safe and return to my life, pretending I knew nothing. That would be a betrayal of my grandfather's memory. He had entrusted this secret to me because he believed I would do the right thing. But what was the right thing? Go public? Tell everything to the press? It would cause a colossal scandal. My father's company would be destroyed. His reputation, his life, everything would be ruined. And though I despised him for what he did, the thought of personally destroying my own father's life was terrifying. And my mother? What would happen to her? She had spent her life as his shadow, but she loved him. This scandal would destroy her, too. I was stuck. I needed advice, someone who knew Grandpa in those years, who could corroborate the story and help me figure out what to do. I pored over the journal again, searching for a clue, and I found it. In one of the early entries, Grandpa wrote enthusiastically about a young engineer he had hired, Ben Carter, a kid with golden hands and a brilliant mind. He understands Prometheus like no one else. Sometimes I think he can read my thoughts. I see myself in him as a young man. Ben Carter's name was mentioned several more times, always with warmth and respect. But after the entry about the betrayal, his name disappeared. He had likely been fired along with Grandpa. I clung to that name like a drowning man to a raft. Ben Carter. If he was still alive, he would have to remember everything. I started my search. In the age of the internet, it wasn't too difficult. I found several Ben Carters in Seattle, but one fit the age profile, and his professional network profile stated he was a retired engineer, formerly of the aerospace industry and later various tech startups. This had to be him. I found his address. He lived in a quiet suburb on the other side of the city. I hesitated for a long time before going. What would I say? Hello, I'm the grandson of your dead former boss. I found his secret diary, and I need your help to destroy my father's empire. It sounded like the ravings of a madman, but I had no other choice. I took the journal and a few photos of the blueprints I had taken with my phone. On a rainy Seattle afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a small, neat house with a well-manicured lawn. The door was opened by an elderly man, short, with gray hair combed to the side and lively, intelligent eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. Yes? He asked, looking at me with curiosity. Mr. Ben Carter? My voice trembled slightly. My name is Chris Vance. I'm Arthur Vance's grandson. At the mention of my grandfather's name, his expression changed. Curiosity was replaced by surprise, then by wariness. Arthur's. He said the name as if tasting a long-forgotten word. I heard he passed away. My condolences. Thank you. Could I talk to you? It's very important. It's about his work. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and let me in. We sat in a small living room filled with bookshelves. I began my story. I spoke haltingly, jumping from one thing to another, telling him about the will, the watch, the workshop, the safe. When I got to Project Prometheus and the journal, Ben Carter froze. He stared at me without blinking. I finished my story and handed him the journal. He took it with a reverence, as if it were a sacred object. He opened it, and his fingers traced the familiar handwriting. He was silent for a long time, turning the pages. Finally, he looked up at me. There were tears in his eyes. I knew it, he whispered. I always knew they did it, but I had no proof. He told me his story. He was a young engineer when Arthur Vance hired him. He had worshipped Arthur, considered him a genius, a visionary. He was one of the few who was privy to the details of Prometheus. He saw the growing tension between Arthur and his sons. Richard and Mark, Ben said with bitterness. They were different. They weren't interested in the science, only in the money and the power. They saw their father as an obstacle. The day they threw Arthur out, they fired me too. They threatened that if I ever said a word to anyone, they would destroy my career, accuse me of industrial espionage. I was young, I had a family. I was scared, and I've been silent all these years. It's the greatest shame of my life. He looked at me. Arthur was a great man, Chris. They didn't just steal his invention. They tried to erase him from history. But he trusted you. He knew you'd find the truth. I showed him the photos of the blueprints on my phone. He stared at them, and his eyes lit up with the same excitement I'd read about in Grandpa's journal. My God, he refined it. This spiral configuration, It's brilliant. This would have solved the overheating problem. He stood up and started pacing the room, gesticulating. Do you realize what you have? This isn't just proof of a crime. This is a working technology. It can be recreated. For the first time, I felt not only the weight of responsibility, but a spark of hope. I wasn't alone. I had an ally. A voice from the past who hadn't let the truth die completely. What do we do, Ben? I asked. He stopped and looked at me with a firm gaze. First, you need to talk to them. Give them a chance. Maybe 40 years has awakened something human in them. But be prepared for the worst. And I'll gather all my old notes. I'll find other people who worked with us. We'll collect all the evidence. And if they don't cooperate, we'll be ready for a war. Ben Carter's words gave me the resolve I needed. The plan was simple, yet terrifying. I had to meet with my father and uncle. Give them a chance, as Ben had said. Though deep down, I knew it was futile. People capable of such a betrayal don't change. But I had to do it. For myself. To know that I had tried everything before pushing the red button. I called my father's office and asked his secretary to schedule a meeting. She was surprised. I never called for business matters. But she called back an hour later and said my father and uncle would see me at 10 the next morning in their conference room. I didn't sleep all night. I rehearsed my speech, choosing my words. I decided not to bring the prototype or the original journal. It was too risky. I made high-quality copies of the key pages from the journal and several printouts of the blueprint photos. That would have to be enough. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror. I was wearing my best jeans and a clean shirt. I still looked like a mechanic trying to look presentable, and that was for the best. I didn't want to play by their rules by wearing a suit. I wanted them to see me, Chris, the grandson of the man they had destroyed. The Vance Innovations office greeted me with the chill of conditioned air and the quiet rustle of papers. I took the elevator to the 50th floor. I was led into the conference room with its enormous table and panoramic windows overlooking the bay. My father and uncle were already there. They sat at the head of the table like two kings on their thrones. Chris, my father began without preamble, his voice cold and impatient. We have a tight schedule. What is it? Uncle Mark leaned back lazily in his chair, studying me with a smirk. I hope you haven't come to ask for a loan for a new lift for your garage. I ignored his jab. I walked silently to the table and placed the folder with the documents in front of them. I came to talk about this, I said, my voice steady. My father opened the folder with a look of puzzlement. Uncle Mark leaned over his shoulder. I watched their expressions change as they recognized the handwriting in the journal and the schematics on the blueprints. The smirk vanished from my uncle's face. My father's face hardened into an impenetrable mask, but I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. What is this? My father asked, his voice low but with a metallic edge. It's Grandpa Arthur's journal. I replied, looking him straight in the eye. And his blueprints. I found them. I know everything. About Project Prometheus. About how you forced him out. About how you stole his work and built. All of this. A heavy silence fell on the room. Only the hum of the ventilation system was audible. Uncle Mark was the first to break it. He laughed. A loud, deliberate laugh. Are you serious? You drag the ramblings of a senile old man in here and expect us to listen? Chris, your grandfather was a genius, yes. But he was insane. He was ready to give away $1 billion technology for free, for all of humanity. He would have ruined us all. We saved the company. We saved his legacy. You didn't save his legacy, you buried it. My voice cracked. You sold out to the oil companies so they would hide this invention from the world. You broke his life for money. My father stood up abruptly, planting his hands on the table. His eyes burned with fury. How dare you, he roared. You, a punk who spent his whole life playing in the dirt, dare to judge me? I built this company from nothing. I gave you life, an education, everything you have. You gave me nothing. I shouted back, jumping to my feet as well. Everything I have, I made myself. And you built all this on theft and lies. Grandpa trusted you. He loved you. I took a breath, trying to regain control. I didn't come here to shout. I came to give you a chance. Publicly admit that the invention belonged to Grandpa. Create a foundation in his name. Start working to revive the project. Do what you should have done 40 years ago. Uncle Mark stepped up close to me. His face was distorted with rage. Are you threatening us? You, a little nobody? Do you have any idea what we'll do to you? We'll crush you. Your workshop will have an accidental fire. You'll be charged with extortion. We have the best lawyers. We have connections. You are nothing, Chris. You're dust under our feet. I looked at him, and I felt no fear, only disgust and a cold rage. I turned to my father. Is that your final answer? He looked at me with the eyes of a stranger. Cold, ruthless, full of contempt. Get out of my office, he hissed. And if you breathe a word of this, you will regret the day you were born. You are no longer my son. Those words hit me like a slap. I had expected threats, anger, but not this. Not a complete disownment. I silently gathered the documents from the table and walked to the door. At the threshold, I turned back. You're making a mistake, I said quietly. Grandpa didn't just leave me a journal. He left me the belief that you have to do the right thing. And I will. I walked out of the conference room and down the long hallway. I didn't feel defeated. I felt free. The bridge between me and them had been burned for good. Now I knew I had nothing to lose. And I knew Ben was right. This was going to be a war. Walking out of the glass tower of Vance Innovations, I felt a strange mix of devastation and resolve. My father's words, "You are no longer my son," echoed in my ears like a death knell for my past life. But with the pain came a realization. My hands were now untied. I was no longer bound by kinship to these men. I was simply Arthur Vance's grandson, and my duty was to him. The first thing I did was call Ben Carter. They refused, I said succinctly. They made threats. Just as you predicted. I had no doubt. Ben's voice was calm on the other end of the line. All right, on to plan B. Come over. I have someone you need to meet. When I arrived at Ben's house, there was another man sitting in his living room. He was in his 60s, with a sharp gaze and an aura of confidence that couldn't be bought. He was dressed in an expensive but understated suit. Chris, this is David Chun, Ben introduced him. One of the best patent attorneys in the country. And, as it happens, an old friend of mine. David Chun shook my hand. His grip was firm. Ben has brought me up to speed, he said without preamble. What you're describing isn't just a family dispute. It's one of the largest cases of intellectual property theft I've ever heard of. If you have the evidence, we can do more than just destroy Vance Innovations. We can set a precedent. I laid out everything I had on the table. My grandfather's journal, the printouts of the blueprints, and the prototype itself, which I had brought with me wrapped in layers of cloth. David and Ben leaned over the table. Ben explained the genius of the Prometheus design from a technical standpoint, while David listened, nodded, and asked sharp, precise questions. The journal is good, but in court, they could claim it's the fantasy of an old man, David reasoned. The prototype is more serious. But we need more. We need witnesses. People who can confirm that Arthur was working on this project, that Richard and Mark were aware of it. I've already made a list, Ben said, pulling out a notepad. The next 2 weeks turned into a spy thriller. Ben and I drove all over the state, tracking down former employees of Prometheus Energy. Many of them were retired. Some were afraid to talk, remembering Richard and Mark's threats from 40 years ago. But Ben was persuasive. He appealed to their conscience, to their respect for Arthur Vance's memory. And people started to talk. We found a former lab assistant who confirmed under oath that he had seen a working prototype. We found a secretary who remembered the fateful day Arthur was locked out of his own company. We even located an engineer who recounted how Richard Vance had forced him to sign non-disclosure agreements regarding the freezing of the project, threatening him with termination. Each new witness, each signed affidavit, was another brick in the wall of evidence we were building around Vance Innovations. David Chun worked in parallel. He hired a team of experts to anonymously analyze the prototype. Their conclusion was unequivocal. The device was not just a working model. It was decades ahead of current technology. It was a bombshell. During this time, the pressure on me began. One night, someone smashed the windows of my workshop. A few days later, I received an anonymous call from a smooth voice advising me to forget the past if I wanted to have a future. I had to change my phone number and start sleeping at Ben's house. My mother called me several times. She was crying, begging me to stop. Chris, you don't understand. They will destroy you, she whispered. Your father, he's not the man you knew. Please, stop this. Mom, I can't. I would reply, my heart breaking. I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for Grandpa. She didn't understand. She was a hostage of her love and her weakness. One evening, as Ben, David, and I sat in his study reviewing the collected materials, David said, I think we're ready. We have enough to launch a lawsuit they can't win. But it would take years. And they would use all their resources to drag it out, to bleed us dry. There is another way, faster and more devastating. What is it? I asked. We don't go to court. We go to the board of directors and the key shareholders. David's eyes gleamed predatorily. We'll give them a private presentation. Show them everything. The journal, the witness testimonies, the expert analysis of the prototype. We will prove to them that their entire company is built on a lie, that its founders are thieves. No investor wants to be associated with such a toxic asset. They will devour Richard and Mark themselves to save their own money. The plan was audacious and brutal, but it was just. This wasn't revenge. It was the restoration of justice. I'm in, I said. Ben nodded. Arthur would have approved. A smart solution, not brute force. David Chen smiled. Excellent. Then let's start preparing the presentation. The show is about to begin. I felt a cold calm settle over me. I was no longer just a mechanic. I was not a failure. I was my grandfather's grandson, and I was going to give him back his name. Preparing the presentation took another week. It was a week spent in a state of maximum concentration, similar to how I'd prep a race car for a competition. Every detail had to be in place, every system checked, with no room for error. David Chun was our director. He rented a conference room in a neutral downtown Seattle hotel and sent out anonymous invitations to all the board members and the top 10 shareholders of Vance Innovations. The invitation only mentioned an urgent meeting concerning fundamental risks to the company's future. The combination of intrigue and threat was designed to ensure a full house. Ben was in charge of the technical side. He prepared slides with blueprints, test results, and quotes from the journal. He planned to personally present the technical assessment of the prototype, explaining in simple terms what a treasure Arthur had possessed, and, consequently, what a skeleton the company now had in its closet. My role was the most difficult. I had to tell the story, not as a prosecutor, but as a grandson. I had to convey to these people in expensive suits not just the facts, but the emotions, the thrill of discovery, the pain of betrayal, the weight of 40 years of silence. I rehearsed my speech dozens of times, pacing Ben's living room. I wanted every word to be calibrated to hit its mark. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I went out onto the porch of Ben's house. Seattle was shrouded in fog. The city lights blurred in the milky haze. I thought about what would happen tomorrow. I was about to push a button that would set off a chain reaction, capable of destroying not just a company, but people's lives. Yes, they were thieves and traitors. But one of them was my father. I pulled out my phone and found an old photo in the gallery. I was about 7. My father was tossing me in the air at the beach. We were both laughing. He hadn't always been a monster. Or had I just refused to see it? Was there a moment he could have turned back from this path? Or was the greed always there, and Project Prometheus just became its catalyst? I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting. Chris. Her voice was filled with anxiety. Mom, I said, my own voice sounding foreign to me. I just wanted to say, I love you. Whatever happens tomorrow. She was silent for a few seconds, and I could hear her holding back sobs. Oh, Chris. She whispered. I love you too. More than anything. Please be careful. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing. The weather, my long-neglected shop. We both avoided the main topic, circling it like a black hole. After hanging up, I felt even more alone. She was the only thread connecting me to that family, and tomorrow, I was going to cut it. I went back inside. Ben was awake. He was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea. Nervous? He asked. I nodded. I keep thinking, am I doing the right thing? Ben looked at me with his wise eyes. Chris, in life, there are rarely perfectly right or wrong decisions. More often, we choose between bad and worse. Your father and uncle made their choice 40 years ago. They chose money and power over honor and family. Everything you're doing now is a consequence of their choice, not yours. You're not destroying anything. You're just turning on the light in a dark room. What people see in that light is not your fault. He took a small metal object from his pocket. It was a perfectly machined stainless steel screw. You know what this is? He asked. This is the last part your grandfather and I made for the prototype. On that very day, before they threw him out, he gave it to me and said, keep this, Ben, to remember what we almost achieved. I've kept it for 40 years. Tomorrow, when you speak, remember what this is all for. Not for revenge, but so that men like Arthur never again lose to men like his sons. He handed me the screw. The cold metal seared my palm. I closed my fist around it. And in that moment, all my doubts vanished. I knew what I had to do, and I knew I wasn't alone. Ben was with me, David was with me, and my grandfather was with me. In the morning, I put on a simple dark sweater and jeans. I didn't want to look like them. I brought my grandfather's journal with me. It had to be there. When the three of us, me, Ben, and David, walked into the conference room, everyone was already assembled. 12 men and women whose faces I'd seen in business magazines. They sat around the table, talking in low voices, their faces a mixture of curiosity and irritation. They didn't know that in an hour, their world would change forever. David Chen stepped to the front and cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. My name is David Chen. What you are about to hear may shock you, but it is the truth, and it concerns the very foundation of the company in which you have all invested your money and reputations. The history of Vance Innovations is a lie. A tense silence fell over the room. The show had begun. David Chen spoke briefly, but his words landed like hammer blows. He outlined the situation in legal terms: theft of intellectual property on a grand scale, fraudulent conspiracy, the deliberate suppression of a technology of global significance. The faces in the room grew increasingly tense. Next, it was Ben's turn. Like an old professor, he began his lecture on Project Prometheus. He didn't bog them down with complex formulas. He spoke of a dream, of clean energy, of a future that had been stolen. He showed the blueprints, explained the working principle of the prototype. In the eyes of these cynical business people, I saw flickers of amazement and even awe. They, more than anyone, understood the scale of the missed opportunity and the scale of the hidden truth. Finally, it was my turn. I walked to the center of the room, clutching my grandfather's journal. I looked into the faces of these people and began to speak. I didn't read from a script. I told the story of my family, the story of a brilliant father and his two sons, a story of trust and betrayal. I read excerpts from the journal, and my grandfather's voice, full of hope and then despair, seemed to fill the room. I finished my story with the last entry. They stole my dream. My boys. What am I to do? I fell silent. A dead quiet hung in the room. No one moved. The only sound was the hum of the projector. David stepped forward again. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the most important part. The prototype. It exists. It works. Our experts have confirmed its authenticity and its potential. And it, along with all the patents Mr. Vance Sr. managed to secretly register, legally belongs not to Vance Innovations, but to the sole heir to whom he bequeathed it, his grandson, Christopher Vance. He paused, letting the information sink in. This means, he continued in an icy tone, that your entire company, all your technologies based on these stolen principles, are illegitimate. Right now, Chris Vance could file a lawsuit that would not just bankrupt you, but wipe you off the face of the earth. But he doesn't want to do that. He wants justice. He laid out our demands on the table: the immediate resignation of Richard and Mark Vance from all positions, a public acknowledgement of Arthur Vance's achievements, and the creation of a multi-billion-dollar foundation in his name to fund Project Prometheus and support independent inventors. The first to break was one of the oldest board members, a gray-haired man named Harrison. Is this true? All of it. I simply nodded. At that moment, the conference room doors burst open and Richard and Mark Vance stormed in. Someone present had obviously tipped them off. Their faces were crimson with rage. What is going on here? My father roared. What right do you have to convene the board behind my back? Richard, sit down, Harrison said coldly. You have some explaining to do. Explaining? Uncle Mark laughed hysterically. This pup, this mechanic, spouts some nonsense, and you're listening. We'll grind him into dust. But his words no longer carried any weight. The shareholders and board members looked at them not as leaders, but as lepers, as a massive problem that needed to be solved urgently. Richard, Harrison said slowly, the company was built on your father's stolen technology. Is that true? My father looked at me. His gaze was pure, unadulterated hatred. He knew he had lost. He was a crazy idealist, he hissed. He would have destroyed everything. It was a confession. A murmur went through the room. People jumped from their seats, shouting, calling their lawyers. The world of Vance Innovations was collapsing before my eyes. Harrison raised a hand, calling for silence. He looked at my father and uncle with icy contempt. I expect your resignations on my desk by the end of the day. No golden parachutes. You'll be lucky if you don't end up in prison. Now get out. My father and uncle stood in the middle of the room, crushed and humiliated. Everyone who had fawned over them just yesterday now looked at them with disgust. They turned silently and walked out. When the door closed behind them, I felt the tension that had held me for weeks finally release. I nearly fell, but Ben caught my shoulder. We had won. The scandal didn't leak to the press, just as David had planned. The board handled everything quietly. Richard and Mark were dismissed in disgrace. The company issued an official statement, regretfully announcing the discovery of historical intellectual property misappropriation at the company's inception, and announced the creation of the Arthur Vance Foundation to atone for the wrongdoing. Their empire didn't completely crumble, but it was forever tainted. Their names were erased from its history, just as they had once erased their fathers. That evening, I sat in my old workshop. Not my grandfather's, but mine. The smell of oil and metal was calming. I was alone. The family, of course, had completely disowned me. My cousins sent me hateful messages on social media, calling me a traitor. Other relatives simply stopped answering my calls. I had become the pariah who had destroyed their meal ticket. Even my mother didn't call. I understood she needed time. I sat at my workbench, holding the small screw Ben had given me. I had won. Justice had been served. But for some reason, my heart felt empty and cold. I had restored my grandfather's honor, but I had lost everything else. Or maybe, I had never really had it in the first place. Months passed. The noise surrounding Vance Innovations died down. The company, having undergone a rebranding and a change in leadership, continued to operate, but the shadow of the scandal would hang over it for a long time. The Arthur Vance Foundation was established and began its work. I was invited to join its board of trustees, and of course, I accepted. Ben Carter and I became its chief consultants, selecting projects from young inventors who, like my grandfather once did, dreamed of changing the world. My life returned to a familiar rhythm, but everything was different. I continued to work in my shop, but now it was more than just a way to make a living. It was my sanctuary, the place where I felt like myself. My relationship with my family never recovered. My father and uncle disappeared from the radar. I heard they sold their shares in the company and left Seattle to avoid further legal action. My mother called sometimes. Our conversations were short and sad. She loved me, but she couldn't forgive me for destroying her world, even if it was built on a lie. I came to accept it. I had chosen my path. One morning, I got a call from Mr. Henderson, my family's former lawyer. I was surprised to hear from him. "Chris, good morning. I have something for you. It concerns your grandfather's will." "But everything was already read," I said, puzzled. "Not everything," Henderson replied mysteriously. "Arthur was a very prudent man. He left a second, sealed will, which I was instructed to open only under specific conditions. And those conditions, let's say, have now been met. Could you come to my office?" Intrigued, I drove to see him. In his office, with a view of the city I had helped to change, he handed me a thick envelope. "Arthur asked me to give this to you personally when—" Henderson hesitated. "When justice regarding him had been restored. I've been following the situation. I believe now is the time." I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in my grandfather's familiar handwriting, along with a stack of documents. "My dear Chris," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you succeeded. It means you turned out to be exactly the man I always saw in you, brave, honest, and not afraid to get your hands dirty for the truth. I am more proud of you than words can say. I knew that in exposing my sons, you would likely be left with nothing. The family would turn on you, and their money, built on lies, would bring you no joy. So, I took care of you. I was never poor, Chris. I just didn't care for money. After I was thrown out of my own company, I didn't sit idle. I consulted for other startups, invested small amounts in young, talented people, just like I once was. I did it secretly, through trusted intermediaries. Some of those companies failed, but some of them soared. As it turns out, I had a knack not only for inventing, but for investing. I lowered the letter and looked at the documents. They were brokerage statements, stock certificates for well-known tech companies, deeds to property in California. I scanned the final figures. My head spun. The amount was astronomical. Hundreds of millions of dollars. I, Chris Vance, the mechanic from Georgetown, had suddenly become one of the wealthiest people in Seattle. I picked up the letter again. "This money is yours, Chris. It's honest. It was earned with intelligence and hard work, not betrayal. Use it as you see fit. Live, travel, Buy yourself 1,000 lifts for your workshop. But I ask one thing of you. Don't let this money change you. Remain the same guy who loves to work on engines. And, if you can, continue my work. Help those who create, not those who sell. That is my true inheritance. Your grandfather, Arthur. I sat in the chair, looking out at the city, and tears streamed down my face. They weren't tears of grief or loneliness. They were tears of gratitude. Grandpa hadn't just left me money. He had left me a blueprint. He had given me an opportunity one had never dreamed of. I looked down at my hands, at the oil ingrained in the skin. Henderson was watching me with a quiet smile. He was a great man, the lawyer said. Yes, I replied, wiping my tears. He was the best. I left the office, but this time I didn't feel alone. I felt my grandfather was with me. He hadn't just restored justice through me. He had given me everything I needed to build a new world on the ruins of the old one. A world based on his values. And I knew exactly where I would start. A year passed. Seattle went on with its life. The skyscrapers still pierced the clouds, and the rain still drizzled most of the time. But for me, everything had changed. I didn't move into a mansion on the lake. I stayed in my modest apartment in Georgetown. I didn't buy a Porsche. My old pickup truck was still my best friend. But I no longer spent all my days under cars. I sold my auto shop to my assistant, reserving the right to come by any time to keep my skills sharp, as I joked. My new job was my grandfather's workshop. But I didn't just preserve it as a museum. I turned it into something more. With the money Grandpa left me, I bought the adjacent properties and built a modern laboratory complex next to his old house. I called it Arthur's Workshop. It wasn't another soulless startup incubator. It was a place where young, talented inventors with nothing but an idea and a fire in their eyes could get everything they needed: equipment, materials, funding, and most importantly, mentorship. Ben Carter and I spent all our time there. Ben, with his immense experience, helped the kids with the theoretical side. And I was the chief mechanic. I helped them build their prototypes, taught them how to use the machines, and found unconventional solutions when things went wrong. My hands were once again covered in oil and rosin, and I was perfectly happy. We weren't chasing profits. The main condition for all residents of Arthur's Workshop was that their inventions had to serve people, not just enrich shareholders. One of our teams was working on cheap and efficient water desalination systems. Another was creating next-generation prosthetics controlled by thought. And in the heart of the complex, in my grandfather's old workshop, which we kept in its original state, a special group of scientists continued the work on Project Prometheus. We were still a long way from a commercial model, but we were already seeing our first successes. We had managed to recreate a working prototype, and it was even more efficient than the one Grandpa had built. One day, my mother came to visit me at the workshop. It was the first time in a year that she had initiated a meeting herself. She looked older, but her eyes no longer held that hunted sadness. She walked silently through the new complex for a long time, looking at the young people at work, at the blueprints, at the life buzzing around her. "He would be proud of you, Chris," she said quietly when we were alone in Grandpa's old workshop, standing by his workbench. "He's proud of all of us," I replied. We sat on the porch, just as I once did with Grandpa, and talked for a long time. She told me my father was living somewhere in Florida, barely speaking to anyone. She had divorced him. She said that only now, free from his influence, did she realize what a gilded cage she had been living in. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't expect her to. It was enough for us that we could simply talk again. Standing at the window of Arthur's Workshop that evening, looking at the glowing lights of the laboratories, I thought about my journey. I had lost the family I knew, but I had found a new, larger one, a family of like-minded people, of dreamers, of creators. I didn't become a businessman or a socialite. I remained Chris Vance, a mechanic. But now, I wasn't just fixing cars. I was helping to fix the world, little by little, one part at a time. I looked down at my hands. They still smelled of motor oil. And to me, that smell was the scent of my grandfather's true inheritance. Not a legacy of money or power, a legacy of creation. And I knew that this was a legacy I would carry with me for the rest of my life.